Welcome to the History in Pixels channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. What would you do if you discovered that justice in the Wild West was a market economy like no other? Forget heroic duels. The reality was a transaction of ropes, furious mobs, and punishments so brutal they would make any modern court seem like a luxury service. Punishment number 1, summary hanging. The fastest sentence in the Wild West. No court, no judge, no defense. On the American frontier, all it took was an accusation, true or not, for the rope to settle the account. The vast majority of victims never had a chance to prove their innocence. Justice lasted less than an hour. Death just a few seconds. And when we say seconds, it's no exaggeration. Judge Isaac C. Parker, the hanging judge, sentenced 160 men to hanging in Indian Territory. Of those, 79 were actually executed. Parker was not a sadist. He was trying to impose order where the law barely existed. But the line between justice and cruelty in those times was as thin as the profit margin on a rope. And who carried out these sentences? Men like George Malladin, the Prince of Hangmen. For over 2 decades, he supervised at least 60 executions. His ropes were personally prepared, soaked, dried in soap to ensure what he called a humanitarian result. One of his favorite ropes was used in 11 hangings. He was proud of its return on investment. But hanging was not just punishment. It was a spectacle economy. At the execution of the conspirators in Lincoln's assassination in 1865, thousands requested tickets to watch. Only soldiers and officials were granted access. Outside, crowds gathered and trains arrived packed with the curious. Death was the most attended event in the United States that day. And not every execution went as planned. When Blackjack Ketchum was hanged in 1901, the rope was measured incorrectly. The impact did not break his neck. It tore his head from his body. Executioners developed formulas to calculate the ideal length based on the condemned man's weight. But mistakes were frequent and always fatal. One way or another, public executions in the Wild West were social events. Entire families brought their children to watch. Vendors set up stalls around the scaffold. The death of a condemned man was Sunday entertainment, a market reminder to the whole community. Follow the rules or the rope will be your next companion. And everything had a literal cost. A record from 1849 from the Santa Fe court in New Mexico reveals that a single execution cost over $110, the equivalent of $4,500 today. Rope, lumber for the gallows. The executioner's pay, the prisoner's meals in his final days. Death had a price tag. In the Wild West, even killing was a business. But the rope did not always do its job. Bill Longley, one of the most feared outlaws in Texas, was captured by vigilantes and hanged as a horse thief. The rope snapped and Longley survived the fall. His fate, however, was only postponed. In 1878, he was officially hanged by the state. The frontier did not forgive. It only delayed the inevitable, like a bad debt. Records from 1875 in Arkansas describe the ideal gallows. A platform about 6.5 feet off the ground, a beam about 12 in wide to support the ropes, and even a sloped roof in case it rained. Not out of consideration for the condemned, of course. It was to protect the spectators. In the Wild West, death needed to be comfortable for those watching from the outside. And when the execution failed, the result was terrifying. The condemned man slowly suffocated, thrashing for minutes, while the crowd watched in silence or horror. Clinton Duffy, former warden of San Quentin, called these failures dirty hangings. The frontier could not always execute efficiently, but this was only the beginning of what was to come. Punishment number 2, mass lynching, when the mob decided who deserved to die. Unlike summary hanging, which at least pretended to have authority, lynching was pure mob violence. No trial, no defense, just an enraged mob that chose its victim. Approximately 4,742 people were lynched between 1882 and 1968. No one was ever punished. Montana holds the record for the bloodiest vigilante movement in American history. Between 1863 and 1865, hundreds of suspected horse thieves were hunted and killed in massive mob actions. Texas, California, and the Deep South were also constant hotspots where the state did not reach. The rope and the trigger took over, and innocence was a dispensable detail. In Tombstone, Arizona, 1884, John Heath was dragged from jail by a mob and lynched in the public square, suspected of involvement in a robbery that ended in death. There was no conclusive evidence. The mob did not need evidence. It needed a body hanging. And there was no age limit to the brutality. Francisco Cotto was only 15 years old. In Los Angeles, a mob identified him as a suspect in the murder of a woman. They dragged the young man down Alama Street, stabbing him along the way. Before he could die from his wounds, they strung him up with a rope. All just a few blocks from the sheriff. No one intervened. The very word lynching carries a dark history. It probably derives from Charles Lynch, an 18th-century Virginia justice of the peace who administered rough justice. The practice spread across the frontier as a market correction for cattle thieves, horse thieves, and anyone who displeased the community. A rumor was enough. An unfounded suspicion was a sufficient sentence. The brutality provoked an international reaction. Foreign governments condemned the United States for the lynching of their citizens on American soil. Between 1887 and 1903, the State Department paid $480,000 in reparations to China, Italy, Great Britain, and Mexico. How can a country defend free markets without preventing mobs from killing innocents? On the rarest of occasions, there were consequences. In 1915, the Leon brothers were lynched in Pima County on suspicion of horse theft. Those responsible, Deputies Robert Fenter and Frank Moore, were convicted of second-degree murder. Sentences ranged from 10 years to life. But in 1917, the governor pardoned them upon leaving office. Justice came and went with the same speed as a market fluctuation. Other lynchings were business disguised as justice. In the Johnson County War in the 1890s, large Wyoming ranchers hired mercenaries to lynch small settlers who were disputing land. Whoever had money bought the rope and chose the target. The Wild West was a system where economic power decided who lived and who died. But the real number of victims may never be known. Of the 4,742 documented cases between 1882 and 1968, individual murders, bodies never found, and names never recorded are left out. Every statistic hides hundreds of stories without a face and without a gravestone. The Wild West buried its secrets along with its victims. Most will never be unearthed. And the victims were not chosen at random. Mexicans, Chinese, Native Americans, ethnic minorities were disproportionate targets. Researchers estimate that 597 Mexicans were lynched between 1848 and 1928. For decades, these numbers were ignored by official American history. The frontier did not kill equally. It chose its victims based on the market demand for scapegoats. Punishment number 3, scalping. The removal of a person's scalp, alive or dead. One of the most terrible practices of the frontier. It was practiced both in intertribal conflicts and by American colonizers who paid official bounties for scalps as proof of an enemy's death. It was not barbarity from one side alone. It was a shared market in inhumanity. Governments financed the practice. In Mexico and American territories, scalps were worth money, men, women, and children without distinction. James Kirker, an Irishman turned scalp hunter, led mercenaries who killed Apaches in exchange for bounties. His group collected hundreds of scalps in the 1830s and 1840s. Killing became a profession. The practice was so profitable that it generated fraud. Fake scalps. The scalps of Mexicans and mestizos were sold as if they were from indigenous people. No one verified the origin. A scalp was a scalp. The money was the same. The frontier did not merely tolerate barbarity. It turned it into an industry. Where there is a bounty, there are those who will kill to collect it. Scalping was also psychological terror. It was not enough to kill. The proof had to be displayed as a trophy. Scalps were hung on posts, carried as ornaments, or presented to authorities as macabre documentation of mission accomplished. For the attacked communities, every displayed scalp was a message. No one is protected. No place is safe. American soldiers at the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864 took scalps and body parts as war trophies. Some were publicly displayed at a theater in Denver to the applause of the audience. What we now call a war crime was cause for celebration on the frontier. With the advance of colonization, scalping gradually diminished. But its marks remained on the following generations. Collective trauma, destroyed territories, and a cultural scar that books took decades to acknowledge. Scalping was not just punishment. It was a chapter in the systematic dehumanization that defined the conquest of the West. The written records are scarce, not because the practice was rare, but because documenting it was risky. The few accounts that survive reveal a reality that contradicts the romantic myth of the Wild West. The frontier was not a land of simplified heroes. It was a territory where cruelty knew no limits and no sides. Punishment number 4, bounty hunting, when your head had a price and anyone could collect it. Wanted, dead or alive. In the Wild West, those posters turned human beings into merchandise. All it took was a printed face and a dollar amount for dozens of bounty hunters to go after the target. It did not matter if he came back alive or dead. The payment was the same. And who were these hunters? Men like Tom Horn, who worked for the Pinkerton Agency before becoming a hired assassin, or Bass Reeves, the legendary black marshal who captured over 3,000 fugitives in his career. Some were former soldiers, others reformed criminals, many simply desperate men looking for easy money, even if it cost a life. Bounty values varied according to how dangerous the target was. Billy the Kid had his head valued at $500, equivalent to more than $15,000 today. Jesse James was worth $5,000, a fortune that attracted even his own friends. The greater the crime, the higher the price. The higher the price, the more hunters willing to kill without asking questions. The Pinkerton Agency was the largest criminal hunting organization of the era. Founded in 1850, it came to have more armed agents than the United States Army itself. They pursued Jesse James for over a decade. They hunted the Dalton brothers, Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid. Where the law did not reach, the Pinkertons did, and they charged dearly for it. But the line between hunter and murderer was thin. Many killed first and verified identity later. Bodies were dragged for miles to be photographed as proof. In some cases, innocent people were killed for resembling the target on the poster. A similar face, similar clothing, and a bullet settled the doubt. The mistake was only discovered too late. John Wesley Hardin was one of the most wanted. Accused of killing more than 40 men, he had a bounty of $4,000 on his capture. He was finally caught in 1877 by Texas Rangers in a train car. He spent 15 years in prison, studied law, and became a lawyer. But in 1895, he was shot in the back of the head in a saloon. The frontier did not forgive, not even those who tried to start over. And there were those who profited from anyone's death. In the Lincoln County War, armed men were paid per head with no questions about who the victim was. Pat Garrett became famous for killing Billy the Kid. A shot in the dark that brought fame but no official bounty. Garrett died years later, shot on a deserted road. The irony of the frontier spared no one. Wanted posters were distributed across the entire territory, printed in series, nailed to posts, train stations, saloons, and sheriff's offices. Some carried detailed descriptions, height, weight, scars, eye color. Others just a poorly drawn sketch, but all carried the same message. This man is worth money. Find him. Bring him in. Dead or alive. Robert Ford became known as the coward who killed Jesse James. In 1882, lured by the $10,000 bounty, Ford shot the man he considered a friend in the back. He received the money, but also public contempt. He became a circus attraction, reenacting the murder. 10 years later, he was shot dead in a saloon. The bounty brought wealth, but it never brought peace. Bounty hunting was not justice. It was commerce. It turned lives into numbers and deaths into transactions. Any armed man could become an executioner. Any fugitive could become a target. The system created heroes and villains, but mainly it created a market where human life had a fixed price. And in the Wild West, that price was almost always paid in blood. Punishment number 5, vigilante executions. When armed citizens took on the role of judge and executioner at the same time where the state did not exist, vigilantes filled the vacuum with organized violence. And the most frightening part, many times they were supported by the majority of the community. One of the first groups was the San Francisco Vigilantes, formed in 1851. They hanged criminals, were dissolved, and returned in 1856 when the city became corrupt. Hundreds of similar groups emerged across the American West. The idea was simple. When the law fails, we take over. The problem was that we could mean honest citizens or disguised murderers. In Montana 1864, vigilantes hanged the sheriff of Bannock, Henry Plummer. Controlling the local press, they painted Plummer as the leader of an outlaw gang called the Innocents. But modern historians question whether the real criminals were not the vigilantes themselves. History was written by the winners. And in the Wild West, the winners held the rope. After the Civil War, the Reno Gang terrorized the Midwest, leading to the formation of the Southern Indiana Vigilance Committee. On the next attempted train robbery, vigilantes captured and lynched the leaders, Frank, William, and Simeon Reno. There was no court that could protect them. Frontier justice knew no appeal and no second chance. The problem with vigilantes was not just the violence. It was the corruption of power. Groups that started out legitimate became tyrants. Using masks and threats, they intimidated any opposition. In some cases, the vigilantes themselves were criminals using the facade of justice to eliminate rivals and steal land. The frontier did not distinguish heroes from villains. Punishment number 6, collective punishment. When an individual crime served as a pretext to destroy entire families or groups.